Okay, the labs for week 7, week 8, and week 9 for the clinical orientation course. Basically, 7 and 8 are just practice of the competency assessment. So I allow the students to pick whichever setup they would like to practice with. So if they feel like they need more practice one day with the laparotomy and next day they want to do the laparoscopic, I basically allow them to do whichever setup they want. And then they just go through the entire competency assessment, again, trying to utilize less and less crutches or resources and just trying to do it independently and get ready for that final competency assessment. Remember that the students will only be performing one of the setups for their competency assessment, but they need to be prepared to do both of them. So they will have weeks 7 and 8 really just for their own practice so that they can get really good at those skills that are associated with that. As the instructor, you're really going to be watching them, making sure that they adhere to their aseptic principles, making sure that they're not making mistakes and going, oh, well, I wouldn't do that in real life. You know, really holding them accountable and making sure that they're following the technique that they're going to be utilizing when they're in the OR. So remind the students, these 2 weeks we really focus more on efficiency. So we talk about how speed is important, but not so much that it starts to decrease the quality of their work. So speed is one thing, being fast is one thing, but being efficient is a different thing. So we really talk about minimizing the downtime in between tasks so that they're moving efficiently from one task to the next task to the next task, and really trying to decrease the amount of time in between tasks. We remind the students that they have 45 minutes from when they open the back table until they hand the knife. So the time that it takes them to go through the case cart and also to perform the closing counts, the suture identification, the med identification, and the post-op duty identification at the end are not part of their 45 minutes. We tell them that if they run out of time, any skills that they don't perform in that 45 minutes, then they will lose those points for. I really tend to give the students about a 5-minute cushion, so it's really more like 50 minutes to account for any aseptic breaks that they have to correct as they're performing their competency assessment. So, but we tell them it's the 45-minute time frame that they need to focus on from when they open the back table until they hand the knife in order to get all those skills done. Now, we also remind them about that med identification at the end, so they have to identify the class and action of their medication that's on the field. They also have to tell us 5 duties that they have as the first scrub during the post-operative phase in order to clean up the sterile field. So disposing of the sharps, handling the specimen, wiping down all the surfaces in the room, mopping the floor. You know, there's several things that they could identify, so they just need to identify 5 of those. And then at the very end, they will have to identify suture for one of 4 procedures. So either a cesarean section, an abdominal hysterectomy with a bilateral salpingo oophorectomy, a hernia repair with an insertion of mesh, or a bowel resection with a suture anastomosis, where they would actually suture the bowel back together with the 2 layers of suture that would be utilized to close that. So we will probably have the students do that in more of a online type of a version. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work, but we will work with you in order to have the students identify that suture for those. The way it works in Lincoln is I have about 25 sutures laid out on a field. They draw a number for one of those procedures, and then they get a sheet where out of those 25 sutures, they have to pick the suture that they would utilize for that procedure. They have to put it in order and then identify the specific skills that would be utilized or the specific procedural sequence steps that would correlate with each of those sutures. So we'll figure out a way how we're going to do that with our students. I'm not 100% sure about how we're going to do that in the distance sites yet, but we'll figure out that because we'll want them to incorporate that suture identification into their competency assessment setup. Now, they are learning that information in Procedures 1 class. We don't give them that information. I tell the students that if they want to look it all up and then send it to me, I will let them know if it's correct or not. So you can do that with your students as well, but they are being provided that information in the Procedures 1 class. Okay. We also remind them that there will be one planned aseptic break during their competency assessment. So it will be things such as holes in filters, holes in towel wrappers, missing indicators, things that they should be watching out for already anyways. You know, maybe it's somebody who's unsterile touches their gown tie, you know, anything that they should be paying attention to. So I tell them not to worry about it because it's things they should be paying attention to anyways. It's nothing that's going to be out of the ordinary that they haven't been practicing already. So you'll want to remind them of that. Just try to reassure them that they've been practicing the skills that they need in order to catch that as they've been practicing for their competency assessment. So just again, you know, watching them, making sure that they are really good on their foundational knowledge of the aseptic breaks and how to correct them and those kinds of things. So then week 9 is when we will actually perform the competency assessments. So the students don't do any lab this week. They simply come in and perform their competency assessments, which take about an hour-ish to perform. So we'll work with you on how we're going to set up the times for the students to perform those competency assessments in their specific site. And figure out the times and the dates that those will be performed. But as they are graded, they do have to receive an 85 on that competency assessment in order to pass it. If they don't get an 85, they do have a redo that's available to them in either Asepsis 1601 or clinical orientation. If they use the redo in Asepsis, they do not have the option to do a redo in clinical orientation. They would get a 0, and then they will fail the course because the competency assessment counts for 45% of their grade. If they do the redo and they get above an 85, then they get their first grade. So say they got a 73 the first time, they pass their redo, then they get a 73 in the class, which will count as 45% of their grade. They may or may not pass the class depending on how the rest of their grades are, being that that grade will count as 45% of their grade. But they do have that redo option available to them if they did not utilize it last quarter in the 1601 course. But they do have to get an 85 in order to pass and go on for that section of their grade. Okay, so, but there may be specific skills within the competency that they don't pass. Maybe they're really struggling putting on their gown, or they made a lot of breaks, and so they may fail a skill but not fail the entire competency. If that's the case, we'll kind of want to do some remedial work with that student and bring them in the following week where they'll have to re-demonstrate that skill to us to make sure that they're competent in that before they'll go out to the clinical sites next quarter.